Hello and welcome to Bible Break with me, Steve Griffiths. Good to see you again, or for the first time, if you're here for the first time, a sort of 20-minute, 30-minute Bible study. And today we are looking at Job chapter 1, verses 7 to 17. We thought about Job chapter 1, verses 1 to 6 before, and then we skipped. I don't quite know why we skipped, but we skipped to Job chapter 2 after that. So anyway, we're back now at Job chapter 1, 7 to 17. And it'd be great to hear from you, whether you're following me live or whether you are on catch up. Please leave some comments, interact with it. It'd be great if you've got any questions, any thoughts on the passage or any thoughts on anything else. Then please do feel free to put them into the feed. It would be good to hear from you. And so today we're really thinking about our sinfulness and God's grace, which is at the heart of the gospel, isn't it, really? So a really good theme for us to be thinking about from Jonah chapter 1. And just to recap the story, I'm sure you know the story of Jonah anyway, but just to recap, Jonah had been commissioned by God to go to Nineveh, which was east of where he was living. He was living by the Sea of Galilee, and he was commissioned to go to Nineveh to proclaim God's message there. And Nineveh was sort of in modern day Iraq, sort of over there, really. But Jonah was completely petrified of doing this, so he ran away from God and he went west. He actually went to Spain. So he went about as far away from where he was supposed to be as he possibly could. And then he was hiding from God. He was running away from God. He was hiding from God on the ship. And there was a huge storm. And the sailors were, well, we'll come on to that in a few moments' time. But anyway, there was a huge storm anyway. And Jonah was hiding down in the hold of the ship, and then he came up on board, and that's where we're picking up the story today. And I think that it is fair to say that Jonah's life was a complete mess, right? I think he had really messed up. He had disobeyed God, and now he was paying the price for that. Now, it would be very easy for us, wouldn't it, to judge Jonah for that. But, you know, at the end of the day, I think we're all Jonah, aren't we? We've all messed up in our lives. We've all run away from God. We've all hidden from God. Maybe you are at the moment running away from God or hiding from him. And sometimes we make bad choices in life as well, just like Jonah did. And that results, of course, in there being a storm. And as Jonah found himself in the heart of a storm, so we often do as well. And I therefore think that Jonah is you and me. And so the story of Jonah is not in the Bible because Jonah is some exceptional man. I think he's in the Bible because he's the norm. He represents humanity having run away from God. He represents you and me. So that's really the importance of having him in the scriptures. Paul said, didn't he, in Romans chapter 3, I think, all have fallen short. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And that's certainly the case in my life. I guess it's the same in your life as well. So what can we learn then about ourselves from this next part of the story of Jonah? What can we learn about our sinfulness and God's grace towards us? Well, there's three things I want to pick up on today. And the first is to say that sin is about our relationship with God. When we think about sin, very often we tend to think about it in terms of things that we do wrong, the bad thoughts that we have, or when we behave in an inappropriate way, or when we make wrong choices. Now, of course, all of these are examples of sin. They are examples of sin in our lives. But fundamentally, at its heart, sin is actually about a flawed relationship with God. I think there's a gaping chasm, isn't there, between what we confess with our mouths, what we believe in our hearts, and how we actually live out our lives. we want to follow God. We want to be faithful to God. We want to honor him. But the way we live our lives is so often completely diametrically opposed to that. And that was certainly the case in Jonah's life. If we look at this passage in Jonah, in verse 8, the sailors say to Jonah, "Who is to blame for this?" They're talking about the storm. "Who is to blame for this?" And they turn to Jonah and they say, "What are you doing here? What country do you come from? What is your nationality?" And Jonah's reply to them in verse 9 is very interesting, because Jonah says to them in verse 9, "I am a Hebrew. I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made land and sea." Now, technically, he is right, of course. He was a Hebrew. It was within his culture to worship the Lord. But there was a huge chasm between that declaration of who he was and the reality of how he was living his life. The circumstances in which he now found himself were a far cry from that declaration of faith. There was a huge disconnect, wasn't there, between what he professed about himself: "I am a Hebrew, I worship the Lord, the God of heaven," and how he was actually living his life. He was on the run from God. He was hiding in the bowels of a ship. He was trying to get as far away from God as humanly possible. So we could say that Jonah has the right answer doctrinally. He knew his faith, but he had the wrong answer experientially. His life didn't bear out the facts of the faith that he was proclaiming. And that is so often the case for us, isn't it, as well? How we live our lives is a far cry from the faith that we profess to have. Let me know if that is the same for you as well. I'm sure it's not just me. And any comments you got, just pop them on the feed. It'd be great to interact about it. But anyway, this disconnect between what Jonah knew was doctrinally right and his experience of how he was actually living the faith. That I think is the root of all of our sinfulness. We know what we believe. We know that God is worthy of our worship and our praise. We know that we should be obedient to him. But there's this disconnect, isn't there, between what we know to be true and how we live our lives. Now, of course, we all want to address the problem of sin in our lives. None of us like living in that disconnect, in that kind of state of limbo. We want to become faithful to God. But the only way to do that, I think, is to focus on our relationship with God, to meditate deeply on what God has done for us, what Jesus has done for us, and to build a stronger relationship of love with God. Because the thing is, if we just try to stop sinning, we're going to fail, because it's beyond us. I mean, we can't just say, right, from now on, I'm going to be a less jealous person, or from now on, I'm not going to get angry with people, or I'm going to stop being so judgmental towards people. It doesn't work like that, does it? If we just try to do that in our own strength, then we're going to fail. We're not going to succeed in that at all. We may have the best intentions, but if we try to do it in our own strength, then of course we're going to fail. The only way to reduce sinfulness is to increase our experience and our love of God, to proactively pursue God and allow ourselves to be pursued in love by him as well. The more we fall in love with Jesus, the more we allow our lives to be shaped by that love, then the disconnect decreases. It's all about love at the end of the day, that connection with God through Jesus Christ. So if you are looking to become less sinful and more obedient in your life, don't try, and do it in your own strength. You're going to fail. It's not going to happen. But just focus on Jesus. Focus on falling in love with Jesus more and more. And the more our hearts are moved towards God, then the greater that reality will be, and the less we will be inclined towards sin. It's all about the relationship. And then secondly, from this passage in Jonah 1, we realize that sin against God needs to have something done about it. When we sin against God, there are always consequences. And sin always needs addressing. Now, I'm not saying on a human level, if people sin against you or sin against me, then we need to kind of make it public and bring down judgment on them or whatever. But when we sin against God, we need to remember that there is also always a consequence, and that's what we have here in Jonah chapter 1 verses 11 to 16. It's a really interesting part of the story, and I think that this part of Jonah sort of hints towards the future of the story of salvation that is outlined in Scripture, and that is at the very heart of God. Jonah's disobedience, it needed dealing with to appease the anger of God, for the storm to stop. And in verse 11, the sailors turn to Jonah and they ask him a really interesting question. They say, "What should we do to you to stop the storm? What should we do to you to stop the storm?" And Jonah replies in verse 12, "Throw me into the sea and it will calm down." That's fascinating, isn't it? Because what we have here is a hint that a sacrifice needs to be made to atone for sin, to make things right with God. What must we do, say the sailors, to stop the storm? Jonah says, "Throw me into the sea and the sea will become calm." So there's a sort of sacrifice there that is hinted at. Now, of course, Jonah offers himself to be that sacrifice. But in the New Testament, the sacrifice is Jesus, isn't it? It's the death of Jesus that calms the storm of sinfulness and restores equanimity where previously there had been chaos. So there's no amount of human effort that can calm the storms in life. There's no other way to atone for sin other than through the sacrifice of Christ. And the sailors, of course, didn't want to do that. They didn't want to throw him overboard. They wanted to try to sort the problem out themselves. As we read in verse 13, the sailors tried to get the ship to shore, rowing with all their might, but the storm was becoming worse and worse, and they got nowhere. Isn't that like you and me in our own lives? It's certainly like me when, just trying with all my might to get my life right again, but just actually getting nowhere because, we can't do it. We need God to calm the storm for us. And through the atoning sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, the storms in our life become stilled and all is made well. And then thirdly and finally, from this passage, God shows us grace when we get things wrong. Jonah had been thrown into the sea. He was in the midst of a raging storm, and without doubt, Jonah was about to drown. But then we come up with a most extraordinary act of grace from God in verse 17. It says this: "At the Lord's command, a large fish swallowed Jonah, and he was inside the fish for 3 days and 3 nights." Now, I don't want to get sidetracked at this point as to whether this was a fish or a whale, or whether it was even plausible that such an event could have actually happened. That's kind of not really what we're about today. Those details are not really important to the story itself. But what is important is that God saw Jonah drowning as a result of his sin, and he sent a rescue plan. Now, that is not what Jonah deserved. Jonah had been disobedient. He'd run away from God. He was hiding from God. He didn't deserve to be rescued by God. He was disobedient, and in his sin, he deserved to die. But God doesn't give us what we deserve. Thanks be to God for that. God's grace is so enormous that he does not give us what we deserve. God shows us grace when we run away from him, when we fail him, when we try to hide from him, when we end up in a really big storm, often of our own making in life. The amazing truth is that God does not give us what we deserve. He shows us grace, and he rescues us from our lowest moments in life. So, in a metaphorical sense, then, Jonah's sin was swallowed by God's grace. As Jonah was swallowed by the large fish, it's a kind of metaphor for God's grace, his rescue, the fact that our sin gets swallowed up by his grace. And of course, that's exactly what the cross of Christ was all about, wasn't it? Jesus showing us ultimate grace by dying for us. And Jesus knew that. In Matthew 12, Jesus was being questioned by the Pharisees. Do you remember? And they were trying to catch him out. And they said to Jesus, "Teacher, we want to see you perform a miracle." And what does Jesus reply? He said this: "You asked me for a miracle? No, the only miracle you'll be given is the miracle of the prophet Jonah. In the same way that Jonah spent 3 days and nights in the big fish, so will the Son of Man spend 3 days and nights in the depths of the earth." So Jesus is here alluding, of course, to his death and his resurrection as the means by which all sin will be dealt with and swallowed up. So this really is then, I think, a quite amazing part of the story of Jonah. And through it, we learn some really incredible truths. We learn that, yes, we do all sin. We all sin, we all fall short of the glory of God. And there is nothing that we can do about that in our own strength. But God shows such grace towards us, even when we are completely undeserving, that he swallows up our sin forever through the death of his son Jesus on the cross. So we can say quite rightly that sin belongs to us, but salvation belongs to the Lord. We are eternally grateful for everything that God has done for us through his son Jesus. And we praise his name for his eternal grace and his love. So there we are. That's that section, I think, of the book of Jonah, chapter 1. Thank you for being with me today. I'm going to be back again very soon, and no doubt move on through the book of Jonah with you then too. So if you're watching live, you're watching on catch up, thank you for being with me, and I'll see you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.